Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into, well, the background and journey of a figure who's stepping into a really significant role.
A key figure, yeah, in the new Apostolic Church, Helge.
Right. And you've pulled together quite a collection of sources for us, articles, biographical notes, maybe some interviews from church publications, it looks like.
They cover his life, his career before full-time church service, which is interesting in itself,
Hmm.
then his path through the various church offices, and of course, the really big news, his recent appointment as the designated successor to the international church leader, the Stam Apostle.
So our mission here is to kind of synthesize all that,
Mm.
pull out the key facts, but maybe more importantly, look for the personal insights these sources offer.
Exactly. We want you to get a really well-rounded understanding of the person taking on this huge role. And, based only on what these specific materials tell us, think about what his background and his stated views might mean for the church's future.
Consider this your shortcut, basically. Your briefing without needing to wade through all the original documents yourself.
Precisely.
Okay, so getting past just the headline announcement, where do we start setting this stage? Basic bio.
Let's start right at the beginning. The sources tell us Helge Muschler was born August 8th, 1974, in Tübingen, Germany.
Okay, and grew up elsewhere.
Yeah, spent his childhood, grew up in Freudenstadt, that's in the Black Forest region.
Nice area. Do the sources give us any feel for his family background?
A little bit. He's noted as being the fourth child and the first son.
Ah, okay.
And baptized and sealed in the church the same year he was born, 1974. After school, he did his civil service in a retirement home.
Right. Standard path for many then. And his studies took him away from the Black Forest.
They did. In 1995, he moved up north towards Hanover for studies, lived in Garbsen first, then Hanover proper.
Okay.
And the sources also mention his current family, married to Anne Juliet since 2007, and they have a son born in 2013.
Right. Now, this next bit, I think, is where it gets really interesting, especially thinking about leading, a global church organization. His professional life before he went into full-time church service was quite different.
It really was. The sources are clear. He trained and worked as a lawyer, a Rechtsanwalt, starting in 2003.
And not just any lawyer role, right? He had a significant management position.
Yeah, quite significant. He was the managing director of the Geschäftsführer for two organizations linked to tax consultants in Lower Saxony, Niedersachsen. One was the Chamber of Tax Consultants itself, and the other was their pension fund.
Wow. Okay. So serious administrative and legal responsibility there.
Definitely. And academically, he also pursued that path, earning a doctorate in law, a doctor in 2005.
And he reflected on that time. What did he think of that work?
He did. The sources quote him saying he really liked the variety of the job, found it exceptionally interesting and diverse.
That's telling, isn't it? That appreciation for variety gives you a sense of the kind of non-church experience and skills he's bringing to the table.
Absolutely. Legal training, high-level administration, dealing with professional bodies. It's a strong background.
So let's pivot then. How did his journey within the church structure unfold? Because the sources show a pretty steady progression, starting quite young.
Very young, actually. His first office was under deacon back in 1994. He would have been just 20.
Okay, under deacon.
Yeah.
And in the New Apostolic context, that involves sort of supporting roles in the local congregation.
Generally, yes. Practical help, maybe some administrative tasks, assisting the priests and deacons.
And then the steps came fairly regularly after that.
Seems so. He was ordained diacon in 1996. Diacons have more direct involvement in pastoral care, assisting in services.
Right.
Then a bit of a gap, maybe due to studies and starting his legal career, but then priester in 2008. A priest has broader pastoral duties, including conducting services.
Okay.
And then things moved quickly. Later that same year, 2008, evangelist. That office often has a focus on ministry work and outreach within a district.
So priester and evangelist in the same year.
Yes. Then Bezirksevangelist, district evangelist in 2010, taking on more leadership across several congregations. And finally, Bezirksältester district elder at the end of 2012. That's a senior role, overseeing a whole church district.
That is pretty rapid movement through those district roles between 2008 and 2012.
It suggests his abilities were recognized quickly at that level.
And then came a really major step up in 2015.
Huge step. Ordination as an apostle. This was done by the current international leader, Stam Apostel Jean-Luc Schneider, on November 15th, 2015 in Zwickau, Saxony. He was 41 then.
And becoming an apostle, that shifts the focus dramatically, right? From district to a much broader, often international responsibility.
Absolutely. Apostles are part of the global ministry responsible for guiding and caring for large church regions, sometimes spanning multiple countries or continents.
And that ordination definitely marked the start of his responsibilities expanding beyond Germany.
The sources track this clearly. Initially, as an apostle, his area included parts of Niedersachsen, where he lived, but also Poland. Then came another significant appointment in 2021, February 28th. He became a Bezirksapostelhelfer.
An assistant district apostle.
Exactly. Appointed again by Stammapostel Schneider, a district apostle leads a very large territory, often multinational, so being their helper involves taking on substantial leadership across that wide area.
And the geographical scope of his works just kept increasing, didn't it, according to these sources?
It really ballooned. His assigned area grew to cover Bremen, all the Nordic countries, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden,
Wow.
plus the UK and Ireland. And on top of that, a whole swath of German states. Hamburg, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, Schleswig-Holstein, Thuringia, and all of Niedersachsen.
That is an enormous, incredibly diverse area right there. And the sources mentioned Berlin and Brandenburg being added later in 2021.
Yes, November 14th, 2021. The material explains this was a strategic move preparing for the merger of the regional churches covering northern and eastern Germany, which then happened in May 2022.
Ah, makes sense.
And his remit grew even further, actually. It came to include countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. We're talking Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan.
So you're looking at someone who, in just a few years as an apostle and helper, gained experience navigating vastly different cultures, languages, political contexts, administrative systems.
You really are. And the sources note one more thing pointing towards this trajectory since 2024. He's been part of the NI International Coordination Group.
What does that group do?
It's basically an advisory body for the Stammapostel on issues affecting the church globally. His inclusion there, well, it suggests he was already being integrated into the top level of international church strategy and discussion.
Okay, so all this progression, the offices, the rapidly expanding responsibilities, the international involvement, it all seems to build towards the huge announcement detailed in the sources.
Yeah.
Pentecost Sunday, June 8th, 2025 in Wiesbaden.
That's the pivotal moment this deep dive centers on. Stammapostel Schneider formally announced Helge Muchler's appointment as Stammapostelhelfer, Stammapostel Helper.
Which is a specific role distinct from district apostle helper.
Yes, it's a role directly assisting the international church leader. And crucially, alongside that appointment, Stammapostel Schneider named him as his designated successor.
The next Stammapostel. And the sources actually include some quite personal comments from Stammapostel Schneider about how he reached this decision.
They do. He was remarkably open about it. Mentioned he'll be turning 65 in September 2025, and that he plans to retire at Pentecost 2026.
So, a clear timeline.
A very clear timeline. And he spoke about the weight of choosing a successor. Said he had, quote, long prayed, yes, wrestled with God to be shown the right person.
Wrestled with God, wow.
Powerful language, isn't it? And he stated very clearly that he was now certain that Bezirksapostelhelfer Helge Muchler was that person.
So the transition plan is laid out now.
Yes, the sources confirm the plan. Helge Muchler is set to be ordained as the new Stammapostel at Pentecost 2026.
And where is that ordination planned?
Significantly, it's planned for Kapstadt, Cape Town, South Africa.
Interesting. Taking it straight to the global south, highlighting the international nature right from the start.
Seems like a very deliberate choice, yes.
How did Helge Muchler himself react? What did the sources report about his immediate response to this life-changing announcement?
His public reaction, as reported, was framed entirely in terms of faith. He described it as the call of God, expressed complete trust in that divine calling. He said he looks forward to walking the path of faith together with the worldwide church community until Christ returns.
And there was a specific request he made?
Yes, a rather humble touch, actually. Yeah. He specifically asked the global congregation who are connected via broadcast for their prayers.
That's quite a moment. So beyond the titles, the dates, the official stuff, the sources, maybe especially interview material, give us some real glimpses into the person, don't they? What stood out to you there?
Well, one thing I found really revealing was his reflection on that huge regional church merger he was involved in preparing.
The northern and eastern Germany one.
That's the one. He candidly admitted his very first thought was basically, wow, this area is huge. How on earth will that work? A very human, practical reaction.
Right, understandable.
But then he contrasts that initial feeling with his current perspective, saying, essentially, we'll manage. with God's help and mutual love. He even talks about finding beauty and courage now in those vast, diverse regions.
That shift is fascinating. From feeling overwhelmed to finding faith and potential in the collective effort. It says something about his approach, maybe.
I think it does. A blend of acknowledging the practical challenge but relying on faith and community to overcome it.
And the sources have some smaller, more personal touches, too.
They do. Someone asked him what he'd enjoy doing if you were just back in a local congregation without all the big titles.
And his answer.
Really simple. Greeting people at the door and singing in the choir.
Huh. Interesting. Points to valuing that direct connection, that community activity.
That grassroots level. And maybe it connects back in a way to what he valued in his legal career, that variety. Different kinds of engagement seem to appeal to him.
Makes sense. What else? Reading habits.
Mentioned reading a book on community by Romano Guardini. And a fun little detail, his favorite book series as a kid was The Three Investigators.
A classic.
Yeah.
And any mention of practical preparations for this global role? Loaded.
Yes, definitely. He specifically mentioned working on improving his English, and he acknowledged that learning some Russian would be really helpful for traveling in large parts of his current and potentially future area of responsibility.
Practical steps? Did he offer anything like a personal motto?
He sort of demurred on having a formal one, said he hadn't really thought about it, but then he added, if he had to invent one on the spot, it might be, I have hope.
I have hope. Simple, but... Well, given the scale of the role, that feels quite significant, doesn't it? A leader choosing hope as their anchor.
It carries weight, yeah.
Now, one of the most insightful parts of these materials, I thought, was his reflection on saying yes to the different church offices over the years. How did he describe that internal process? It wasn't always straightforward.
No, and this part really gives you a sense of his understanding of a calling. He talked about his very first office under deacon when he was 20. He actually felt some resistance initially because he was about to move away for studies.
Okay.
But his district elder at the time used a simple phrase, Amt ist Amt, office is office. He said it didn't logically explain anything, but somehow it broke through his resistance by conveying the seriousness, the nature of the call itself, which resonated with him.
So, less a logical argument, more a sense of duty or divine weight.
Seems like it. Then the step to priester, he said, was a really big internal hurdle. He needed time to process it, even though he apparently felt the call sometime before finally accepting.
Oh, interesting. So wrestling with it again.
Yes. And becoming an apostle. He described that as an even bigger step, something that fundamentally changed his life. But he emphasized it was a deep, conscious yes, a pledge he felt very strongly and clearly about making.
So you see this pattern emerging.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some initial hesitation or wrestling, but ultimately a conviction-based acceptance.
Exactly. And that pattern seems to continue right up to the present. When he spoke about accepting the Stam Apostel Helge role and being named successor, he said he immediately felt the immense magnitude of it internally.
I can imagine.
But his reflection was, because he perceived it as coming from God, channeled through the Stam Apostel, there wasn't really another option but to trust. He accepted it with what he described as a very clear internal yes, rooted in faith and trust.
It really reinforces this idea that for him, this isn't just a career path. It's a series of responses to what he understands as divine calls.
That's the strong impression given in the sources, yes.
So the materials also touch on his thoughts about church traditions and how things are developing. What are his perspectives there?
He speaks very highly of pastoral care, seelsorge, calls it a beautiful tradition and a fundamental pillar of the church.
So valuing that personal connection and support.
Deeply. He expressed hope for a renewed desire and focus on it throughout the church, seeing it as key for building and nurturing relationships.
And what about change or development in the church?
He seems to appreciate recent shifts towards greater individual responsibility for one's faith and creating space for more open, maybe fear-free dialogue about faith. Without prejudice.
Fear-free dialogue. That's interesting phrasing.
Yeah. He feels there's perhaps less pressure now to just conform and more acceptance of people being on different paths or having different perspectives, which he views positively.
But that immediately raises the challenge, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How do you lead a global church with all that diversity? Some wanting faster change, some slower, different cultural views. How does he approach that tension, according to these sources?
His approach seems grounded in focusing on what he identifies as the core truth. Jesus Christ. Around that central point, he uses this metaphor. He sees the diversity of views, the different speeds of acceptance, as a colorful flower meadow.
The colorful flower meadow. I like that. Not a uniform field.
Exactly. He explicitly says it's not about trying to make everyone the same. Instead, he stresses dialogue as the way to achieve unity within that diversity. The ability, he says, to walk through differences without wanting to eliminate them.
Walk through them, not erase them.
Yeah, valuing the other person and their viewpoint, even when you disagree, and finding ways to stay connected despite the differences.
That's a powerful leadership concept. The sources also include a very, very personal story he shared about a time he felt distant from God.
Yes, this was quite a candid section in the interview material. He spoke about a difficult period in his life where he felt emotionally cut off from God. He even admitted making accusations against God during that time.
Wow, that's honest.
Very. What brought him back, he explained, was the slow realization that even when he had pushed God away emotionally, God hadn't left. God remained present, remained loyal. He actually used the word stirrer, like God was even more stubborn, more persistent in his presence than he was in his turning away. And realizing that persistent grace allowed him to turn back and, as he put it, stand again before God's majesty.
And he connected this whole experience to the Bible, to the book of Job.
He did. He mentioned reading the book of Job extensively during that difficult time, searching for answers to suffering, the age-old question.
Did he find them?
Not in the way you might expect. He said the dialogues between Job and his friends didn't provide the answers. For him, the profound insight, which he admitted took a long time to really sink in, came right at the end. When God confronts Job with his own power and mystery.
And Job is silenced.
Right. Job simply recognizes God's greatness and his own limitations. Muchler's takeaway from that wasn't a neat explanation for suffering, but the realization that the ultimate answer to suffering is God himself. God's presence, God's reality.
Yeah. Simple but profound, and difficult, as he said.
Incredibly difficult to fully grasp and live, he acknowledged.
That personal struggle and the resulting theological reflection, it definitely gives you a deeper insight into his faith foundation. What about stepping into the big leagues, so to speak, joining the Assembly of District Apostles? How did he find that?
He described having, significant respect for the very experienced leaders already in that group. Admitted feeling a bit nervous initially.
It's understandable.
Especially when the Stam Apostle first called on him to speak. But he said what quickly put him at ease was the atmosphere he described, a very warm welcome, and a tangible sense of love and support from the other district apostles.
So a supportive environment at that top level.
That's the picture painted, yes.
And one last comparison the sources mentioned thinking about leading services, something really small, like for one person in Greenland versus maybe 30,000 in the Congo.
Yeah.
How did he view those extremes?
He explicitly said he values both experiences immensely. They offer different kinds of connection.
How so?
The tiny service in Greenland he described as incredibly close, intense, intimate, a very direct personal connection. In the massive services like in Africa or maybe a huge youth convention, he acknowledged you can't possibly see individual faces from the altar. But, he said, you feel something powerful in the air. A connection, a bond forged by the Holy Spirit that makes even those huge gatherings feel somehow personal, not anonymous.
So appreciating both the depth of intimacy and the breadth of that spiritual connection in large groups.
Exactly. He finds value in both ends of the spectrum.
The sources also touch on a really fundamental theological point, this tension between being created in God's image, but also being a sinner. How does he talk about that?
He tackles it head on, calls it an irreconcilable ambivalence. Like fire and water, he said two truths that seem logically contradictory.
Yeah, it's a core tension in Christian thought.
Absolutely. He acknowledges that constant, almost painful awareness of being caught up in sin, feeling like there's no way out through his own efforts. But, and this is key, he immediately balances that with the equally constant awareness that God forgives. Why? Fundamentally, because God finds us good, sees inherent value in us despite the failings.
So it's a paradox humans struggle with, but maybe resolved in God's perspective through grace.
That seems to be his understanding, that God holds both truths, our value and our failing, and bridges the gap with forgiveness.
And he brings it all back to a simpler core idea.
Yes, the interview material suggests his concluding thought on all this complexity is that, at its heart, the Christian faith is actually very simple.
Which is?
God is love, and in love there is no fear. He suggests that sometimes maybe we as individuals, or perhaps the church institutionally, tend to overcomplicate things, and the real need is to keep returning to that simple foundational truth of God's love.
It really sounds like these sources paint a picture of Helge Mutchler as someone quite unique.
Hmm.
You got this blend of rigorous external professional background law management combined with a very deep personal reflective faith journey.
That comes through strongly.
His path through the church offices shows clear dedication, expanding leadership, culminating now in this massive appointment. And that interview material, especially, really adds color. His thoughts on community, handling challenges, that personal struggle, his vision for unity and diversity, focusing on grace and core beliefs.
I think that's a fair summary of what these specific sources offer, yeah. We've covered the foundational biographical facts, traced his journey through the church structure, leading to the stem apostle helper role and the designated succession. And importantly, we've gotten insights into his perspectives on leadership, faith, the church, often through his own reported words.
So this deep dive, based strictly on these materials you brought, gives us and gives you listening a really valuable glimpse into the person who is now set to lead a major international church.
It definitely offers a compelling picture of his journey so far and the principles he seems to prioritize as he steps towards this huge responsibility.
So as you think about all this information we've unpacked, maybe consider some of the tensions Helge Mutchler himself seems to grapple with, according to these sources. How do you navigate those seemingly contradictory truths in your own life or beliefs?
Yeah.
Like acknowledging weaknesses or failings while still holding on to a sense of worth or purpose.
Or perhaps think about that colorful flower meadow metaphor he used for diversity. How might that idea of unity and diversity of, as he put it, walking through differences without wanting to eliminate them, how could that apply in your own communities, your workplace, maybe even your family? It's just something to mull over.